On the anniversary of Mary Shelley's passing, her family opened up her desk. What they found inside was incredibly disturbing. Best known as the author of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's real life was as dramatic and haunting as any Gothic tale. Born in 1797 in London, Mary Shelley was the daughter of the married political radicals Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. Not long after Mary's birth, tragedy struck. Mary's mother contracted a postpartum fever and died, leaving Godwin to raise Mary and her sister on his own. Mary's mother had been a passionate advocate for women's education, and Godwin tried to honor her beliefs by raising Mary in a rich intellectual environment and encouraged his daughter to think for herself. By the age of 15, Godwin described Mary as singularly bold, somewhat imperious, and active of mind. That boldness was about to get her into a great deal of trouble. When Mary and her sister Fanny were children, Godwin married Mary Jane Clairmont. Clairmont brought 2 children of her own, Charles and Claire, and Godwin was delighted with his decision. Unfortunately, no one else was. Godwin's friends found his new wife moody and argumentative, and although Mary became close friends with young Claire Clairmont, she openly despised her stepmother. It's no surprise, then, that she started to rebel. Around 1814, a young aristocrat named Percy Shelley entered Mary's life. She was only 16 at the time. Percy idolized Godwin's radical writing and initially sought his mentorship. But before long, his admiration turned toward Godwin's daughter, Mary. But Percy's past presented a problem for the poet and his intentions toward young Mary. Percy was already married, though unhappily, to Harriet Westbrook, with whom he had a daughter. Percy regretted he ever started the rash and heartless union with Harriet. This was also not his first extramarital infatuation. Despite the promises he made to Harriet, he ignored his vows and began to actively pursue the teenage Mary. Mary was obsessed with Percy, describing him as having wild, intellectual, unearthly looks, and it wasn't long before they were meeting in secret. They famously decided to meet at Mary's mother's grave. Talk about a romantic setting. It was there that Percy declared his ardent passion for Mary. When William Godwin discovered his daughter's affair with Percy Shelley, his reaction was explosive. He did everything in his power to keep them apart and restore Mary's spotless reputation. To Mary, it made no sense. She considered her father a free thinker and a believer in free love. She hadn't realized that in recent years, her father had abandoned many of his former unconventional beliefs. Then again, Godwin had another motive, and it was far less noble. Mary's family was drowning in debt. When Percy arrived, he had promised to rescue them from financial ruin. But right when Mary and Percy were starting their affair, Godwin learned the terrible truth. Percy had been cut off from his wealthy family and didn't have a penny to his name. Godwin was furious, yet despite his outrage, there was nothing he could do to stop the young couple. Mary and Percy ran away to France in July 1814 and took Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont, with them. It was a reckless and desperate move. Her stepmother chased them as far as Calais before giving up, and the trio continued on foot through France until their money finally ran out. The 3 fugitives arrived back in England that September, but Mary was no longer the same girl. Sometime during the journey, she had become pregnant with Percy's child. Confused and frightened, Mary turned to her father for help. She was in for a terrible shock. To her dismay, Godwin wanted nothing to do with her or her situation. The man who once championed free love and rebellion turned his pregnant daughter away. Rejected and penniless, Mary and Percy moved into a small apartment in London, along with Mary's stepsister Claire. For a while, they were content in their newfound freedom. They read, wrote, and hosted Shelley's artistic friends. But under the surface, the cracks were already beginning to show. Mary and Percy's financial situation began to take a toll on their relationship. Their romance began to sour under the weight of poverty. Mary, heavily pregnant and often sick, watched helplessly as Percy fled from house to house, dodging his creditors. Around this time, Mary learned exactly who Percy really was. Disturbingly, Percy almost certainly began having an affair with Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont. Although Mary also believed in free love in theory, she found herself jealous in practice. In late 1814, still pregnant and still reeling from Percy's growing infatuation with Claire, Mary received some troubling news. Percy's wife, Harriet, had given birth to his son, Charles. Percy was overjoyed that he now had a son and heir, while Mary grew more despondent with each passing day. Tragically, the worst was yet to come. On February 22, 1815, Mary went into labor 2 months prematurely and gave birth to a sickly baby girl. No one expected the child to live, but when the end came, it was still devastating. In the depths of her mourning, Mary began having visions of the baby from beyond the grave. Soon after the baby's passing, Mary conceived again, and by the summer she had mostly recovered. Around this time, Percy's grandfather died, leaving him an inheritance that finally eased the couple's financial troubles. In January 1816, Mary gave birth to a healthy baby boy whom she named William. For a time, Mary and Percy seemed to be on the path toward happiness. In May 1816, Mary and Percy traveled with their son to Lake Geneva to spend the summer with Lord Byron. Again, they were accompanied by Claire Claremont. Claire began having an affair with Byron and was soon pregnant with his child. The scandalous group settled in the Villa Diodati and made history. The summer season was terribly rainy, and they spent days at a time indoors. The group decided to pass the time by writing ghost stories. Mary struggled for days to find inspiration, until one stormy night, inspiration finally came. She would write a story about a reanimated corpse. At the Villa Diodati, Mary began work on what would become Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Though she had first intended it to be a short story, the idea soon took on a life of its own, growing over the following months and years into a full-length novel. Even at the time, Mary sensed its importance, later describing that period as when I first stepped out from childhood into life. She published Frankenstein in 1818, when she was still in her early 20s. Once the summer was over, Mary, Percy, and Claire returned to England. Dark news awaited them. Mary's half-sister Fanny had been sending increasingly alarming letters during their travels, describing her unhappy life. The letter they received on October 9, 1816, sent Percy on a frantic search for her, but he found nothing. The truth became clear the next morning. On October 10th, Fanny was found at an inn, having ended her own life. This terrible loss was only the beginning. Exactly 2 months later, on December 10th, Percy received more upsetting news. His wife Harriet, feeling abandoned, had taken her own life also. She left a note asking Percy to care for their son, Charles, while their daughter would remain with her family. Despite Harriet's wishes, her family prevented Percy from gaining custody of either child. Percy was now a widower. Facing legal and societal pressure, he and Mary married in December 1816 under the advice of his lawyers. The marriage was meant to present a united front to the courts and help with Percy's custody issues. The move finally reconciled Mary with her father, William Godwin, but it solved little else. Percy never gained custody of his children, who were eventually placed in a clergyman's home. The following years were filled with uncertainty and disappointment. Clare gave birth to Lord Byron's daughter Allegra, and Mary had a daughter named Clara. Yet their household was far from peaceful. Mary was often irritated by Clare and Allegra's presence. Tensions worsened when Percy continued his relationship with Clare, and the family struggled financially. Percy sank further and further into debt, and his health was also deteriorating. In March 1818, the Shelleys, along with Claire Claremont, moved to Italy for Percy's health. They had no plans to return. At first, the change of scenery seemed to offer some respite. Mary and Percy traveled with a motley group of friends and focused on their creative pursuits. Within months, however, the illusion of peace was shattered. While traveling through Italy in September, Mary's infant daughter Clara fell seriously ill and died in Venice. The loss was devastating. Mary, who had grown up without a mother and had wanted to protect her own children, sank into a deep depression. In the summer of 1819, the Shelleys went to Rome and faced yet another tragedy. Mary's only surviving son, William, likely contracted malaria and died in June. Her grief reached its peak. She later wrote about the agony of what it is to lose two only and lovely children in 1 year, to watch their dying moments, and then at last to be left childless and forever miserable. During this period, Mary became increasingly alienated from Percy, who would later write a poem lamenting, "My dearest Mary, wherefore hast thou gone, and left me in this dreary world alone?" Mary, for her part, couldn't help feeling bitter that they had gone to Italy for Percy's health and ended up losing 2 children in the process. There were only 2 things that seemed to bring Mary comfort, and neither of them were her husband: the birth of her son Percy in November 1819, and her writing. In truth, her husband often caused her more pain than peace. She found solace in beginning her Gothic novella Matilda after William's passing. In 1820, Mary's family faced another shock. Paolo and Elise Foggi, former servants of the Shelleys, revealed that while living in Naples months earlier, Percy had registered the birth of a child, Elena Shelley, as his own, and had even listed Mary as the mother. In the wake of this revelation, wild rumors began to circulate. Historians have long debated Elena's origins and Percy's reasons for registering her as his child. Some suggest the child may have been his with Elise Foggi. Others suggest that she was connected to Lord Byron's circle. Another theory claims Percy had compassionately taken in the girl to comfort Mary during her grief. The Foggis, however, offered a more troubling explanation. They alleged that the child was born to Claire Claremont and Percy. If true, it would have been a devastating blow for Mary, who insisted she would have known if Claire had been pregnant. Tragically, baby Elena passed away in Naples in June 1820, and the mystery surrounding her identity remains unresolved. Italy, meanwhile, continued to bring the Shelleys hardship after hardship. By 1822, Mary was expecting another child and living in the seaside village of San Terenzo at the Villa Magni with Percy and Claire. Also staying with them were Edward and Jane Williams, a couple whose presence added to the household's growing tension. For Mary, it was not a happy time. Part of her unease came from Percy's growing admiration for Jane Williams. Jane's beauty, warmth, and musical talent fascinated him, especially in contrast to Mary, who was still deeply affected by the tragedies that had marked her life in Italy. As his feelings intensified, Percy began dedicating poetry to Jane. He sometimes shared these poems with Edward or with the couple together. He concealed them from Mary. The situation only deepened her sense of isolation. Then, more heartbreak followed. That June, she suffered a miscarriage and lost a great deal of blood, nearly losing her life. Percy's quick action in cooling her body until medical help arrived saved her, but his heroism could not heal their marriage. After their earlier losses, Mary had written, "We have now lived 5 years together, and if all the events of the 5 years were blotted out, I might be happy." Now Percy echoed the same despair, writing that he and Mary no longer had anything in common, and that he longed to escape both the past and the future. The atmosphere in the house grew increasingly somber. Percy's mental health began to deteriorate. He was experiencing terrifying dreams and visions, once waking in panic from a nightmare in which he thought he was harming Mary. Those close to the couple sensed that tragedy was near, but no one could have imagined just how close it truly was. On the 1st of July, Percy and Edward went out on their new sailboat to travel along the coast and visit Lord Byron and their friend Leigh Hunt. They never returned. On July 8th, they were likely caught in a storm, and 10 days later, their bodies were found washed ashore. It was the end of an era. Mary Shelley, who had waited in agony with Jane Williams for over a week, was devastated by the confirmation of her husband's passing. Their bodies were cremated on the beach near Viareggio. Percy's ashes were later interred in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. From that point on, Mary had only one purpose. The following years were devoted entirely to her son, Percy Shelley. She endured whatever challenges were necessary to ensure his well-being. Eventually, she moved back to England and established a modest life with her father and stepmother, rejecting most financial support from her husband's family, as accepting it would have meant relinquishing control over her son's care. Yet Mary's life could not revolve around her son alone. During these years, she felt her social isolation keenly. Many respectable people continued to view her marriage to Percy as scandalous. Nonetheless, she dedicated herself to writing, supporting her father, and editing Percy's works to preserve his legacy, even though the Shelley family forbade a biography of the poet. Still, it was her friends who sometimes hurt her the most. Percy's infatuation with Jane Williams may have been partially painful, because, as biographer Muriel Sparks notes, Mary herself had felt a little in love with Jane. In 1824, Mary moved to Kentish Town in North London specifically to be near her friend. Jane, however, betrayed that trust. Mary soon realized that Jane was not the person she had believed her to be. Their friendship suffered when Mary learned that Jane was suggesting that Percy had preferred her to his wife, implying Mary was inadequate as a spouse. Despite these personal difficulties, Mary Shelley remained admired. Many suitors professed their admiration, but she often declined or treated their proposals with humor. From 1839 onward, Mary experienced mysterious health issues, including frequent headaches and temporary paralysis that sometimes prevented her from reading or writing. Her doctor eventually diagnosed her with a brain tumor, and she passed away in 1851 at the age of 53. When Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, was published in 1818, Mary Shelley was just 20 years old. The novel immediately attracted attention for its originality and daring exploration of life, death, and human ambition. Critics praised its imagination and emotional depth, and it quickly became a cornerstone of Gothic literature. Over the years, Frankenstein has endured as one of the most celebrated works in English literature, cementing Mary's reputation as a pioneering writer and a formidable literary figure. After her death, Mary Shelley left behind poignant reminders of her life. On the first anniversary of her passing, her family opened her desk and found personal items that spoke to her enduring grief and devotion. Locks of her children's hair, a notebook and writings from her late husband, and, most notably, the preserved heart of Percy Shelley. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.